Good day, goeiedag, yebo sabona, mangwanani, jambo, dumelang. Greetings to you wherever you may be. This first volume of Simple Beekeeping for Africa has been compiled to help anyone interested in beekeeping as a hobby or as a potential source of income and upliftment to get started. I will show you many simple manipulations with simple equipment covering the basics of beekeeping from catching a swarm to the cropping and processing of honey. Much of the equipment is very basic and not always the best looking. I have done this deliberately to show that equipment does not have to be state of the arts, it just has to work. The bees are not fussy, but the use of standard size hives with proper bee space is very important. There are two basic types that we will be using. The first one is the normal standard Langstroth hive, invented many years ago by a gentleman called Langstroth. He invented this hive and discovered that bees required a specific amount of space within the hive known as bee space. And this bee space is very important in the construction and design of this hive. The bee space in the old language was about 3/8 of an inch, and in millimeters about 9 to 10 millimeters. And we start off with the floorboard, a heavy piece of wood painted all round, and it's subject to quite a lot of stress and strain, so it's important that it is strong, glued and nailed together, or preferably screwed together. On top of that floorboard goes a brood chamber, and the brood chamber contains 10 frames. Sits on the hive like that. These 10 frames are glued and nailed together and will eventually receive some wax foundation inside here, and onto the wax foundation will be fitted some wires to hold the wax foundation nice and straight. In the brood chamber is where the queen and the whole brood nest is contained, and to stop the queen coming up into the honey storage area we have an apparatus called a queen excluder. Queen excluder comprises a whole lot of wires specifically spaced so that the queen cannot get through, but that the worker bees can pass freely up into this honey storage area. That fits on the hive like that. On top of that goes a honey super, which is the area where the honey gets stored. The honey super, once again, has 10 frames, or sometimes 9. In this case it has got 9 frames, which are separated by a piece of metal called a 9-frame spacer. And the purpose of that spacer is to allow the bees to draw out the honeycomb thicker than they would normally do, and it makes it easier when it comes time to uncap the combs filled with honey. On top of our super goes what we call an inner cover. That is that. Just a piece of plywood or hardboard with a small surrounding frame, and that sits on top of the super like that. A hole is often cut in the top of the inner cover to allow for feeding the bees, or for the use of an apparatus which we'll see later on called a porter bee escape. We next have the roof of the hive, also very heavy, covered with zinc to protect it from the weather, and this completes the whole hive. The entrance can be fitted with a piece of wood called an entrance block or a cleat. This is done to reduce the size of the entrance for small colonies so that they can easily guard the entrance. This can be removed when the colony grows large. This Langstroth hive is universally used throughout the world and is probably the most popular beehive that is in existence at this time. The second hive that we are going to be looking at is this top bar type hive. It's a hive that's been developed fairly recently up in Pretoria in South Africa. and I believe it could be the answer to our rural beekeepers' prayers. It's a very simple hive. It is very cheap compared to the Langstroth, and it lends itself to most manipulations. I'm experimenting with it and finding it an extremely useful piece of equipment. This particular one is made of laminated plastic, like corrugated cardboard, but it's plastic. I have painted this one to make it a little cooler for use in this climate where I live in the Karoo. The space of this hive is equivalent to 1 brood and 2.5 supers of the normal Langstroth hive. And that's a fairly reasonable colony and should suit most people. The frames that are used in this hive can be a frame like that, specifically made to fit this hive. It is interchangeable with the Langstroth hive, but of a slightly different design. As you can see, it has got 2 different sizes of dowling. It has a different shaped top bar and is made specifically for this hive. You can, of course, use in this top bar hive a normal slat of wood known as a top bar, and they will fit perfectly well into this system. These are the sort of slats. These slats are 32 millimeters wide, which is the size of the African bee size comb. From center to center of the comb is 32 millimeters, and this fits normally into the hive like that, or across the hive, and you can fill the whole top of the hive with slats instead of frames. The object of using frames in this case is so that you can put those frames into an extractor and extract the honey without cutting out the comb. If you're a rural beekeeper and you want to cut out the comb and strain it through a cloth, then you would use these slats, which are obviously far cheaper than the frame of that kind. There are 25 of these frames situated along the top of the hive. The bees enter through a little slot underneath there, and the working with this hive I've found extremely easy. The bees remain calm on the comb, and I've found it very, very interesting so far. With this hive, it is normally hung from trees. If you live in an area where you have trees, here where I live there are not many trees, so I have to make a special arrangement to put this hive low down on the ground, normally using a few bricks which sit underneath the handles on all 4 corners of the hive. But you can make any arrangement you like. You can make up a metal stand which would fit under there and have it at waist level so that it's easy to work with. I keep them low for security reasons, keep them out the eye of the public, and you avoid problems with vandalizing and that sort of thing. The hive has a plastic roof which goes over like that and keeps out the weather. I'm going to talk briefly about the advantages and disadvantages of these 2 beehives. Let's talk about the Langstroth hive first of all. One of the main disadvantages of this hive is the price. It is very, very expensive. In South Africa here, somewhere in the region of 450, nearly 500 Rand for that piece of equipment that you see there. It is out of the reach of most of our rural farmers, and they would probably prefer something in the line of our top bar hive. Another disadvantage is it is extremely heavy, particularly when it's got bees and honey in it, cumbersome to move around, and its profile is high. In other words, it sticks out. When it's in the bush, it sticks out, particularly if it's painted a light color like this pale gray, and it is subject to vandalizing by people who find honey and beehives the target for such vandalization. The advantage of this hive, of course, is that it has stood the test of time. It has been used for more than 100 years, and it works perfectly well. The bees seem to thrive in this hive. They become at times a little bit aggressive. When you take the inner cover off, you've exposed the whole of the hive at once, and the bees don't seem to like that too much. And as you'll see with the top bar hive, as you're working with it, you're exposing 1 frame at a time, and the rest of the hive remains covered. With this hive, another advantage, of course, is all the frames are able to go into a centrifugal extractor, and so you have no problems with the extracting of the honey. let's look at the advantages of our top bar hive. First of all, its price, extremely cheap. This hive with the frames complete is around about 200 Rand. It is extremely light, easy to carry around. It is low profile, as I mentioned earlier on, so it's not easily seen from the road or pathways around your house or wherever you have your apiaries. And it is extremely simple to work with the bees. The bees remain extremely calm on these combs for the very simple reason that you are only exposing one face of the comb at a time as you in fact go through with your inspection. As each comb is removed, it's only one other comb that you're exposing. The bees thrive on it. It's a proper bee space for our African bee, and as I said earlier, I think it might be very useful for our rural farmers.